and other people, impulsivity. There are many other types, but these are just some examples. Elopement is certainly a concern for a lot of families within the Hunter and San Filippo communities, but can be seen in other MPS types as well. So one of the things that creates strain and pressure and confusion has to do with what is prompting these behaviors, right? A lot of times families are put in these situations of being the behavioral translators for their children, but a lot of times the families are also feeling their own stress and confusion, especially if behaviors show themselves in kind of new and more extreme ways. I have this example from one of our papers in the past few years on the different ways that a behavior can be explained and the different attributions that could be made. One is the purposeful collision. There are many people with neuronopathic Hunter syndrome who have demonstrated this behavior, many caregivers who have described it. This behavior can be an attempt at communication. It can be an attempt at social interaction. It might be an expression of hyperactivity or elevated energy level. There's often the description of people with Hunter syndrome being aggressive, and there may indeed be moments of aggression, but sometimes the behaviors are misunderstood as aggressive when in fact they have a different meaning or different communication piece. So we've had the privilege now of really talking with families and hearing more about the lived experience of the neurobehavioral symptoms associated with some of the MPS types. And those conversations in combination with data gathering have given us some really important information to understand more about the behaviors and more about the interaction of factors. So, you remember the image that I had earlier where there's, the circle, and there are all these different things that are playing into functioning and playing into things that we are seeing in affected individuals. And this, I think, is a really important illustration of it. So this is a very recent and a deep dive study into the natural history of San Filippo syndrome, looking beyond just the cognitive score and examining the cognitive score in cooperation with some of the other scores that have been obtained. So in this example, you'll see this line at the top represents the parent ratings of gross motor functioning, how often the child is demonstrating independent walking, independent running, various types of large body movements. And then these are the direct testing scores from the Bailey. So what we see here along this y-axis is the developmental age, and along here is the chronological age. So we see on the Bailey that the cognitive scores are lower than the gross motor scores. So the interpretation is that cognitive decline comes before the gross motor large body challenges that emerge. When there's this combination of lower cognitive functioning with relatively more capable gross motor functioning, there are really important implications for behavior and safety, because a well-walking, well-running child can give the there can be misunderstanding on the part of the observer about what sort of intervention is going to work to support that child's behavior and safety, and what sort of intervention that child is going to be able to respond to, and what's going to touch that child. And so this difference that's been demonstrated, I really think the community has long known this, but now we have data to really support it, that this difference in the slopes of decline for behavior, for cognitive and for gross motor, contribute to behavior and safety concerns. Another example of deeper investigations of late that really bring out the important interaction of the cognitive challenges, communication challenges, and behavior challenges has to do with this study that Nathan Grant and Young Bason led, with the really generous and courageous support of a family in the community. For many of you who may know Nathan, he's within the Hunter community. He's the twin of somebody with neuronopathic Hunter syndrome, and he's been a pleasure to work with. He's not at the conference because he just started medical school, so we're very proud of him. So this is a paper that we worked on just this year as we sort of raced toward the newborn screening efforts. I'm going to enlarge this timeline. It's rather complicated, and we won't take time to go through the whole thing, but one of the pieces that I really want to draw out here is that the green arrows represent the sibling who was identified when he was older. He was diagnosed and therefore treated when he was older. That's what the O is for. And then the younger sibling who was diagnosed because of the older brother's diagnosis. So he was treated when he was younger. What we see here are that the brother who was treated when he was older, he had challenges with speaking. He became minimally verbal at 6 years old. He had impaired neurocognitive function. The brother who was treated when he was younger had, his speaking was preserved for longer. He had mobility preserved for longer, and is still showing, the ability to hike, whereas the brother who was treated when he was older is, using an adaptive stroller at certain times for longer distances. Now, what is in the paper and what was communicated by the family is that this difference between the cognitive and the communication capabilities gives the brother who was treated younger more access to childhood diversions like watching TV shows, playing with puzzles, has him engrossed in a lot of activities and diversions that all children absolutely deserve to have access to. The older brother, on the other hand, is not as able to engage in these things, and they're not as meaningful to him. When we think about children being engaged in activities, that engagement can also help support behavioral control, right? Being engrossed, and the engagement also promotes learning and discovery, even when someone is facing a neurodegenerative process. So this is, to me, an illustration of the complexity of all of these different functions interacting to create various functional challenges that can't be whittled down to just a single cognitive score to represent the lived experience of the diversity of MPS types and outcomes. So for the last piece, I want to talk about a little bit more about the impacts. The last discussion transitioned nicely into this. So in terms of the observable symptoms, the impacts that we've heard about is, certainly bias, especially as children grow older and grow physically larger. There is a lot more bias from the unknowing world about, when there are behaviors and when there is dysregulation. For the child, that can create social isolation, reduced access to educational and community opportunities. When there are sleep issues, the fatigue affects the days and further affects functioning. And then, as I touched upon with the gross motor and cognitive comparison, that classic methods of behavioral support may not help that child reach certain levels of peace and support. In terms of the family, there's really trauma that I know has been discussed and really brought out and named, certainly by Melissa Hogan and colleagues and a lot of you in discussions where you've been willing to share. The sleep deprivation, there's the push-pull of, I want those symptoms to be less, but that might mean that something, we're facing progression. It's really hard to maintain social supports. And these are all areas of stress that need to be understood and respected among people who are caring for individuals who are affected. Caregivers and families are often forced to figure out how to manage, and they're sort of put in the position of making the recommendations and making the arguments. One of the pieces that has been so meaningful is, Cara O'Neill from Cure San Filippo reached out to us and said, COVID distance learning is just horrendous. Like, what do we do? How do we manage this? And so, in cooperation with Cure San Filippo and Project Alive and the MPS Society, we put together this paper. I'll give you the link shortly, to advocate for what children need during distance learning. It applies for COVID, but it also applies when children are in distance learning or young adults are in distance learning, distance situations for surgeries and the like. The invisible symptoms have serious impacts too, and they're underappreciated. Particularly when there are focus issues, there can be real misunderstandings about why someone is mentally disengaged. Some of the attributions might be, educators have said, he only works on the project if he likes it, only if it's interesting to him. He's not motivated, he's lazy. And actually what we know is that when attention is really fragile, when there is a focus issue related to disease, people naturally gravitate toward the things that captivate their attention and inspire them. And so they're actually showing problem solving and showing success by gravitating toward the things that interest them. And so that's actually a good thing. That's being a problem solver. That's not being a cherry picker. But those misattributions exist not just for the children who are showing behaviors. And then certainly social isolation. There are some difficulties with social emotional processing, especially if a focus and processing speed are low. That can make the rapid fire interaction with peers a lot harder to follow along and can just lead to some withdrawal. The impact on the family is also still traumatic for people who are caring for an individual with MPS. It is still very challenging to advocate for support, especially when there are things like focus and when there are cognitive abilities that are measuring in the typical range. That can make it particularly hard to advocate and to figure out what works. In terms of the future directions, there's a lot in front of us, and we need more and more work and more collaboration. Some of the things that we're doing are working on developing a behavioral rating scale so that the observations and the explanations and some of the current rating forms can be replaced with something that's much more specific to the unique needs of the MPS community. We're looking at ways we can measure communication for minimally verbal and minimally vocal individuals, and certainly examining what sorts of therapies and supports help in addition to intervention, and really looking to understand more about caregiver experiences, family impact, and access to resources. So all of this has come together through just enormous collaboration with so many people who are so generous, and it's just been a true privilege to work with. And I will put here how to, let's see if I can move this, how to access the publication for any of you who are interested in it. So if you go to our website, this is the website link, and then you click on this button. If any of you want to access the recommendations for schools and therapies for managing distance learning and other kinds of pauses from education or access for medical needs, this would be an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, for that very informative talk. This is the end of our morning sessions, so we invite you now to go to lunch. The buffet will be down the hallway. Please pick up your children from childcare before lunch, and then you can return them. But be back at 12:45 because we have some very important awards to give, and I don't think you'll want to miss it. 12:45. Thank you.